Hello, I'm Bill Carr. I'd like to welcome you to the latest iteration of Shift for Brains, say it fast. I'm thrilled actually with the way it's working out. COVID has affected all of us in various and sundry ways, but it's affected this show in that it's made it more intimate, I think, and more intense. And I wanted to start with this gentleman in the newest iteration for a few reasons. Now, his name is William Randall. He's a professor at St. Thomas University. These are two of his books. And I read both of these books, cover to cover, and they truly shifted my brain. These are just a couple of his books. He was a United Church minister. He's a writer. He's an amazing raconteur when he's talking. I'm fascinated, and I know you will be too. We had a wonderful dialogue, which I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm coming to you from Mi'kma'ki, which is unceded Mi'kmaq territory, Nova Scotia, and Shubuktux, which is Halifax. And I'm thrilled to have sat here in this very spot and chatted with this wonderful gentleman. And this is how Shift for Brains will look for a while. There will be the two people talking or four people talking or whatever we get with Zoom. And I hope that you enjoy this conversation. I trust you will as much as I did. He's become a friend and as I say, shifted my brain about the nature of narrative and how it is truly a driving force in our lives and should be. And the better we understand it, I believe, the better we can live it. So please sit back, watch, enjoy, listen. And anything you want to share with us, please get a hold of me at Shift for Brains. I'll take any and all comments, and I will promise to respond as quickly as I can. And please, if you get a chance, pick up any of the books by Bill Randall. I know you will be as thrilled as I have been. Anyway, enjoy. First of all, welcome to the newest iteration of Shift for Brains. I am honored and privileged to come to you from Shubuktux, which is also known as Halifax, in Mi'kma'ki, which is also known as Nova Scotia, unceded Mi'kmaq territory. It's with a great deal of excitement and joy that I welcome my newly minted friend, William Randall. Not that you're newly minted, Bill, but our friendship is. And he's with me today to discuss narrative and the work that he's been doing on that and some ideas around that. And no doubt we'll drift as we talk, because we do.
Shift for brains.
Shift for brains.
Drift for brains.
I happen to have two of his books. Let me just get them out here properly. There we go. Two of his books right there. And I want to mention that I got the first one, The Narrative Complexity of Ordinary Life. And I was immediately curious about some ideas and issues. And then I got the second book, which went into those issues. So obviously you're moving in a very important and significant train. So while I hold up his book here, I want to just read a bit of his biography. William Randall, Master of Divinity and Education, is a professor of gerontology at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Prior to entering academic life, he was a minister of the United Church of Canada, serving pastorates in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick, graduate of Harvard College, Princeton Seminary, and the University of Toronto, author of several books, the stories we are, reading our lives, the narrative complexity of ordinary life, Tales from the Coffee Shop. I think you have 8 now, don't you?
Yes,
that's correct. And more articles than Carter's Got Pills, which is really good. But I want to get to it. I want to start. First of all, thank you for being here. And how are you, by the way?
good. I'm thankful to be here with you, Bill. And we're in the middle of a snowstorm here, so it's nice and cozy inside. It's great to have a conversation. I guess you've got a snowstorm going where you are as well. So
it's just turned into a rainstorm because it wasn't messy enough.
right.
So that's what we're doing. But I'm going to start with the question, how are you? Because as Canadians, we sometimes miss that opportunity to actually answer that question. And during this pandemic, I've noticed people have been doubling the question. They'll go, how are you? And then they go, no, but how are you? And I think it's what starts us into a bit of a narrative, a bit of a dialogue. So I want you to, first of all, discuss with me how you got into the term. What is the term narrative, first of all, and how did you get into it? Those are the two big questions I want to start with.
Okay, that I'll start with the word narrative, which is, in my view, interchangeable with the word story. If you look in the dictionary under the word narrative, the first meaning is going to be story and vice versa. Uh, that said, the various academic fields that have taken narrative seriously tend to use the word narrative, narrative gerontology, narrative psychology, narrative sociology, theology, etc. Uh, but simply put, narrative slash story is the way, I believe, the way in which we make sense of our lives. Someone has said that the word narrative comes from the original root narrans or narrare. There's two different sort of sources. One means knowing and the other means telling. And I take that to heart because I think as a human being, as human beings, stories, storytelling, story sharing are our fundamental ways of making sense of ourselves, of the world around us, and of engaging in relationship with other people. So we've been storytellers since day one, but ironically, it's only been in the last 30, 40, 50 years that people in the academic world have started to say, hey, there's really something to that, you know? We need to kind of drill down into what does it mean to be narrative creatures, you know? So now your other question there, Bill, was how did I kind of get into this?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you mentioned, I have some background in theology. And when I was studying in seminary back in the 70s, I became aware of something that was at that time being called narrative theology or story theology. And I have a whole section of my bookshelf here of books on narrative theology. But I was immediately intrigued because I grew up in the Maritime Provinces, which is where we are now. And I do feel that there's something particularly rich from a narrative perspective about life in the Maritime Provinces. It's not just how are you, but where are you from, you know? And when you ask those opening questions in the Maritimes, inevitably you get stories. Well, I'm from Montague, PEI originally, and my father was, and so on and so forth. My father was a consummate storyteller. He was also the minister. I grew up in the manse. He could take the most sort of innocuous everyday event and sort of transform it into an entertaining tale. Okay. And that was a big feature of the talks or the sermons that he would give on Sundays, what made the points he was trying to get across that much more palatable and digestible, the stories that he embedded the key points in. So when I discovered at seminary, having followed, which I did for about 10 or 11 years in my own father's footsteps, when I found out that there was something called narrative theology, I was immediately intrigued because of those early roots of mine.
Right.
And so I focused on what was being called narrative theology, and I even went off to university in England ostensibly to do a doctoral dissertation on that topic. But then I realized kind of quickly at my mid-20s that I needed to do an awful lot more living and thinking and reading before I could sort of tackle the narrative nature of human life, and in this case of faith and belief and spirituality in a proper kind of way. So I ended up,
a bit of your own narrative, in other words.
yeah, I needed to build a narrative of my own and have
Yeah.
something to reflect on. Yeah. So I came back to Canada and started my career or vocation for 10 or 11 years as a minister, starting out in rural Saskatchewan. And rural communities, whether they're in Saskatchewan or the Maritimes or wherever, I think I've often thought they present you with the narrative complexity of everyday life kind of in your face, because everybody knows everybody's business, or they make it their business to know everybody's business. Yeah. And you can't sort of slide easily below the radar in a small community. And that's part of its beauty and part of its downside, perhaps, you know, depending upon whether you're the butt of the gossip in the neighborhood and so forth. So that in a just a broad brushstroke, Bill, is kind of how I got to being interested in narrative. Of course, when I was a minister for those 10, 11 years, a big part of my work was listening to people's stories, not in any sort of professional capacity as a therapist or counselor, capital T or capital C, but just as trying to do my work to get to know them. And so when I realized that I needed to make a shift from that line of work, which was rich and interesting but overwhelming, to go back to school, I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to look into this narrative thing again. And so that set me off, having by then acquired another 15 years of life experience and lots of people's stories in my mind. I think it gave me more substance, shall I say, to work with as I dove into the whole narrative world around about age 40.
It's interesting, that progression, and you can hear the arc of your narrative right there. There's a gentleman named Joseph Gold. I don't know if you know the story species, and his contention is that's almost an identifying mark of our species, is that our ability to tell stories, but also the necessity. Yeah. And I was reading Don Siegel's book and a couple of his actually, and the idea of information and energy as being the relational way that we work with each other, and that stories are the sort of key to that, or the narrative, right? Does that follow along with what you are doing? Is that?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why, for me, and for many people, yourself included, to start looking at what narrative/story is and to realize how omnipresent it is, it's like opening Pandora's box. Certainly that's been my experience and my students' experience too, in many respects, because you realize that storytelling and story forming and story imagining is central to so many facets of human life. And I have a little quote that I found earlier today that kind of encapsulates that, if I could just share that with you. This is from a literary theorist named Barbara Hardy, and it's from an article that she wrote back in the 60s, I think. But she has this one sentence which kind of says it all as far as I'm concerned. She says, "We dream in narrative, daydream in narrative, remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love in narrative." Yeah. Relate and feel in narrative, think in narrative. I mean, I don't want to sound too grand and make narrative, the be all and end all to the universe. But I think you're right in saying that we are the story species in ways that the squirrels at my feeder and the chickadees at my feeder don't seem to be. Of course, I don't speak chickadees or squirrels.
I was going to say, maybe they're chatting right now. Maybe they're gossiping about you. You never know. But the thing that I sort of followed through with the idea of sitting in the coffee shop, the first book that I read, The Narrative Complexity of Ordinary Life, Tales from the Coffee Shop, and you sat in the coffee shop and actually watched those interactions daily and noticed repetition and noticed the use of narrative and how significant it was in all of their relationships. The ARC, which is the company that I have, the Atlantic Restorative Company, my wife and I are dealing with relationships all the time, and it's about getting in circle often and having those dialogues and what ends up happening is storytelling. Yeah. And so that narrative happens. My question is, how do you deal with conflicting narratives, or narratives that are challenging? What happens then? What is the process as you see it and as you've discovered it?
Well, I think narratives are always conflicting and bumping up against each other and competing with each other. I mean, it's not at all uncommon to listen to the news and hear something like, well, the narrative coming out of the White House is such and such, but the narrative coming out of, the Kremlin is obviously something different. So we're accustomed more and more to realizing that there can be great wars of huge mega or meta narratives that we get caught in the middle of. But when you're in a relationship, let's say an intimate relationship, and you're having, God forbid, a quarrel of some sort, oftentimes it has to do with two rather different ways that each of you has of storying an event or an occurrence or something in the past or whatever.
Right.
And hopefully you can achieve some sense of, okay, well, that's how you interpret it. That's how I interpret it. We can find some common ground and so forth.
And isn't it even more than interpretation? I mean, and this is the whole issue around a witness. They'll say that, you know, there were three witnesses of an accident, and they'll come back with three different stories or narratives because of their perspectives. And isn't that even more complex when it comes to memory? Because talk about how memory and narrative are a little bit they struggle, don't you
Yeah,
think?
they do. They struggle, and yet you could argue that memory, and I'm talking here about autobiographical memory, not memory
Right.
for how to do things like tie your shoes or remember the days of the week, but
Well,
autobiographical memory, which is how we.
that can become a bit complex too, but let's not go there right now.
But autobiographical memory, I like to say, and I tend to play with words, that autobiographical memory, or sometimes called episodic memory, which is the memory we have of ourselves and ourselves in our world over time. Autobiographical memory is a matter of faction. That there's a sense in which the events of our past, for example, when we recount them to ourselves or to other people, um, are rarely sort of the exact reporting of all the of those events in all their detail and so forth. Inevitably, there is a spinning process that goes on, a tilting, interpreting, depending upon who our audience is and what we think they're interested in hearing. And also because with time, and autobiographical memory scholars have documented this, there is a certain transiency or fading of the details and so forth. And certain details get kind of lost. Certain other details get sort of embellished up because they make for better storytelling. And so memory and narrative, as you point out correctly, have this symbiotic back and forth. It's an extremely complex topic, and narrative psychologists, you can bet your bottom dollar, have spent a lot of ink, spilled a lot of ink exploring the complexities of the narrative dimension of memory, the narrative roots of memory, and therefore, you know, the sometimes uncertain ground on which we each stand in terms of our own sense of identity. Because if our sense of identity is rooted in our stories of who
Right.
we've been over time.
And that was something that you mentioned in the book, that people, that there are stories that actually are signifiers of you. There are stories that are significant to your history, and they're the ones that when you're listening, and you talk a lot about listening and the skill of listening to stories, and letting and hearing not only what's said, but what's not said, or what's repeated and why. Could you go into a little bit of that?
Yeah, I'll start with a little quotation attributed to the African-American writer Alex Haley, who wrote the book Roots, that really got people thinking in a deep way about the history of America and so forth, and race relations. But anyway, apparently once, I think in an interview, he said, every time an old person dies, it's like a library burns down. Right. And I say that to my students and people in workshops, and they go, because everybody knows kind of what that feels like. They've got grandmothers or grandfathers who passed on and all the stories that went with them. But I think in our personal libraries, to use that metaphor, there's lots of different types of story material. And there's a lot of non-story material too, like the random phone numbers that for some reason you remember 50 years after you dated that person, or an address or whatever. There's bits and pieces of it, but there's an awful lot of narrative material in there as well. And as you pointed out, these signifying stories, or sometimes I call them signature stories, which are stories that for whatever reason, I think we each have a collection of that we are more likely to trot out when meeting somebody new, and we want to give them a sense of who we are and how we view the world. So when you say, well, there's a story that I tell, blah, 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 and so out comes one of our signature stories. But then we all have, you know, other categories, secret stories that we don't dare tell, don't know how to tell, haven't yet found the audience to share them with, or the words to put on them. There are short stories about, you know, what we what we did for supper last night. And there are long stories about the first marriage. There are stories about the past, but I think we all entertain stories or storylines about the future, the immediate future and the long range future. There are very specific stories that we can tell where our memories seem to be quite precise and detailed of particular events in the past or just the recent past. But then there are these sort of spread out kind of stories like, well, I remember when I was a kid, I used to go sliding a lot. You know? But there was this one day when I remember I slid on my toboggan down into the barbed wire fence at the bottom of the hill. And that, so we have these generalized and also more specific kinds of stories, shall we say.
And isn't there, I mean, we just mentioned that sometimes the history gets a bit, there's also the idea that sometimes when we're remembering, if there's a hole, our imaginations will fill it in. We're like the humans, we don't like a vacuum. We abhor a vacuum, and we sort of fill it in. And sometimes those stories get filled in very specific ways that aren't necessarily, as you say, historic. Mm-hmm. And yet they become very real to the person telling the story, right?
It's true. That's true. And, if you at a certain point in your life, you might go to talk to a counselor or a therapist or whatever, and that therapist might help you to revisit some of those formative stories where you have filled in holes, and invite you gently to sort of revisit or to reframe or to restory. And maybe regenerate. Maybe, for example, you're carrying around with you a bunch of tragic tales about life growing up on the farm and how hard it was and so forth. And then, with age, with time, and maybe also with some professional assistance, you start to rework those stories that you've carried with you and move them from the tragic category to something not so tragic. And it's been said in this world of psychiatry, I think, that it's never too late to have a happy childhood.
And also that, I mean, that's that reframing thing. And when you ask for a different emphasis, or even, and this is one of the things about the relational aspect of the narrative, is we're telling a story that you and I share, that let's say you and I have had an experience and we go to discuss that. Mm-hmm. I can tell it from my perspective, but I can also attempt to tell it from your perspective, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Like that exercise of putting ourselves, walking the mile in the moccasins, is in terms of narrative is critical, because you suddenly go, well, what did they see, and what did they feel, and what did they experience? And the narrative suddenly stops being an I narrative and starts being an us narrative.
Right? Yes, that's true. And I have a colleague and friend, Karen Scarrett, who is a family and couples counselor, and she has written about we stories in marriages and so forth.
Interesting.
And a therapeutic strategy that she uses is to help members of the marriage, each partner in the couple, to crawl inside the story, the way in which the other person, their spouse, stories a particular event or stories the relationship between them as a whole.
Right. And so that goes back to that idea of changing it from a happy story to a sad story, or a tragic story to simply a revelatory story, right?
Yes. And this is the thing for me, Bill, about the stories that we all carry around inside of our personal libraries, is that there is no end of reworking and reinterpreting and re-generating that's possible. And so, in fact, this is one of the neat things about getting older, is that you can revisit things and see fresh dimensions of those events or experiences that you maybe couldn't at the time. So the story of my life, insofar as there is one story, and that's a question in itself, is continually changing. And I like to use this analogy. If you think of a movie or a novel that has really grabbed your heart or your head or your soul, mm-hmm. And you reread it, or you rewatch the movie, because you get more things out of it, or different things out of it each time. So the story in the novel or the story in the movie comes to an end, but there's no end to the meaning that you can pull from it.
Well, my favorite illustration of that is Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I read it when I was 17 or 18 years old. I read it again when I was about 25. I read it again when I was 35, and I just finished rereading it again recently. And I suddenly realized 4 different novels, 4 different books, four completely different, like they weren't the same at all. And then I realized, of course, they were the same, and it was me. And that, so that even the narrative, the narrative of the other changes with you, but also your own narrative changes with you, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. There's a book written by an author named Wendy Lesser. It's called, I think it's called Nothing Remains the Same, Reading, Rereading, and Remembering. And she does exactly the same sort of thing you just described. She takes texts that have touched her earlier in life, whether they're poems or plays or novels, and revisits them on a regular basis and writes about how, as you just said, new things are pulled, like, because you yourself as the reader, are at a different space and a different place in your life, in your developmental trajectory, on all different levels, and also in the ongoing, ever evolving, ever broadening, thickening story that you are.
And the narrative, I mean, the idea of a social narrative and a personal narrative. I mean, we've gone through the last 4 years with that president in the United States, who shall remain anonymous at the moment. But that whole episode, I mean, the idea of saying something and then saying, no, I didn't say that. That wasn't said. I mean, that whole idea of revisionist in a world that has cell phones and videotape and real-time recording. The social media has really changed the narrative. Do you think has it? Do you see that a lot in your work?
I do, and I don't have the big picture by any means, because we're all living right in the middle of this ever-changing, dynamic world of technology and so forth. But I see it with my students, for example. God love them. And I think I'm giving a very riveting sort of lecture, and I look down and there's 1 or 2 of them glued to their cell phone screen, either checking their Facebook page or texting their girlfriend or boyfriend. I don't know, I don't care. But one of the things, I have to be careful, because I don't want to be sound like an old fogey or grumpy or whatever, but I do have some concern, Bill, that as a species, you talked about our being a story species, which is what Joseph Gould writes about.
Yeah.
There may be some evolutionary things happening as regards our way of storing stuff in life, because if you are addicted to Twitter, for example, I shouldn't use that word addicted, but let's say you use, like some people we've heard of, using Twitter quite a bit, you have only so many characters in which to express an opinion or recount an event. TikTok, I guess, is even more quick. I have never used that. Facebook is about pictures and what the pictures suggest. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. So my sense is that when I and I don't want to sound grumpy, but when you're walking along city streets, and back in the day pre-COVID, when you could walk along city streets and people would be coming towards you and passing you, whatever, it's very common, isn't it, to see somebody approaching the intersection, staring at their screen, assuming that their feet are going to know where to go and not get caught beneath the wheels of a truck. But I guess are we in danger of losing some of our prized capacity to put narrative structure on the events of our lives and share them with other people, and have them share storied events from their life with us, and have a conversation and have a party? Somebody's going to be writing a book or 2, I'm sure, on how present day technology is shifting and changing for better or for worse. To speak about Facebook, different, yeah.
Gary Vaynerchuk is an influencer and an interesting guy who talks a lot about social media. And one of the things, just in response to exactly what you were saying, one of the things he says is, at a certain level, I'm able to, like when I was 12, I could communicate with 12 or 14 people and maybe have pen pals.
Yes.
I don't know if anybody else except us maybe remembers that, but pen pals in some part of the world. But right now, I can pick up this little device and talk to anybody anywhere in the world.
Yes.
And tell my story and share my story
Yes.
and so he kind of pushes the narrative. He pushes the idea that that narrative is changing, yes,
Mm.
but it will only be for the worse if we use it for the worse. Like I think and this is the Facebook thing where everybody shows their good face on Facebook and they show here we are happy, and then it's causing other people. There's a lot of literature about this, that it's causing other people to get quite depressed because everybody on Facebook's happy and my life seems to be a bit of a dog's breakfast, when in fact it's not an open narrative. But that idea of a jaundiced narrative, or a narrative that's not quite accurate, that's as old as time, really.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's nothing new there. That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
just
and just
in defense of things like Facebook and Zoom, which is how we're talking right now, I must say that I am very grateful for the way in which this technology has allowed me to connect and to reconnect in a real life almost kind of way with people. That COVID keeps everybody indoors, rightly so. But this has enabled me to feel like I've got a whole world of great friends, yourself included. And
well, aren't you, just on that note, aren't you connecting with some people that are reading your book? Isn't that part of what's happening on Zoom for you?
yeah, can I say a little bit about that?
I wish you would, please tell.
Yeah,
I think that's because it's an example of where this technology is allowing something rather special, I think.
well, actually, yeah, the one of the two books that you held up there, the one called "In Our Stories Lies Our Strength." Yeah. Um, Unbeknownst to me, I was walking along the trail system here in Fredericton for a nice walk back in the late fall, and I bumped into this chap who I knew from the gym. And he said, "Oh, my wife is enthralled with your book." And I thought, "Oh, wow. A, how did she learn about the book? And B, what's she enthralled by and why?"
Does she
So
want to buy
anyway,
another copy? No.
what's that?
I said, and does she want to buy another copy?
That thought did cross my mind. Anyway, he said, yeah, he said she's giving a whole bunch of copies of that to friends for Christmas. I thought, whoa. Anyway, she reached out to me to do an independent study, which we're working on this semester. She's a mature age student and so forth, but part of her independent study has been to set up a kind of a discussion group of other people that she sent the book to, all the way from the lower north shore of Quebec to the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec to various places here in New Brunswick and so forth. So we had a meeting about 2 weeks ago on a Monday evening, and it was just so interesting to hear what each of the people there were getting from the book. And a couple of them said, "Well, we read the book to each other over supper." I thought, what? Yeah. How sweet is that? So I have no idea. When you understand the same. When you give a talk, when you write a book, you never know how it might, for better for worse, touch people's hearts or minds. So this has been a real affirmation for me that hey, these ideas which I spent some time writing about in 2019 are resonating in, generally speaking, positive ways with a bunch of people who are not in the academy, which is exactly the kind of people that I want to reach out to and speak to and write for going forward.
And I mean, back to the idea of the social reality that we've been living in. Suddenly this pandemic has hit, and I think it has reminded us, or brought to our awareness, even not even reminded us, for some people just awakened us to the idea that we are how interconnected we really are. Yes. and how much we really need each other, and the idea of sharing those stories and the learnings that we can have with each other and from each other and relationally, it has become quite critical. And the one that we're just talking about, it has to do with aging spirituality and narrative. And could you talk a little bit about how not only how the narrative shifts, but how the significance of the narrative shifts when we get into our later years, as we'll call them?
Well, it's true that that things change in our later years, but we of course need to remember that, or at least I believe, that we're storying creatures from day one.
Yes.
As we acquire language and we develop connections with mommy and daddy and sister and brother and so forth, and we acquire the rudimentary skills to tell little stories about what's going on in our 2, 3, or 4-year-old lives. we're moving into the realm of narrative development, which is every bit as important, I think, as psychosocial development, sexual development, moral development, faith development, spiritual development, which I'll talk about in shortly. So, and people have been writing about how our ways of storying ourselves and understanding the story of our life and therefore our identity does shift in noticeable ways from childhood to adolescence to early adulthood to middle adulthood to late adulthood. So there's a continuum there. But
and
I think
just to put a catch on that, we develop meaning from
yes,
stories. The
yes,
language that we're using, the stories give those words some of those words meaning, like not chair, although chair too, I guess, but especially relational words come from those stories, and they change as we grow, right?
yeah. I mean, there's so many factors that work in how in the change that takes place in the stories that we tell, the way we tell our stories, the way we story our lives generally, and that has to do with the extent of our use of language, our opportunities to meet people from other places and other cultures, our travels, our work experiences, our ups and downs. So the narrative development of ourselves, our lives, hinges in profound and powerful ways on the relationships within which we are co-authored in this direction with that person versus that direction with that person, and in this family as opposed to in that family, and the way that the larger stories of the companies we work for and the communities we live in shape profoundly, for better for worse, the political views that we espouse or the theological views that we adhere to. All of these contribute in complex, multi-layered ways into the way our individual, and I'm hesitating to use the word individual in relationship to our story, but
Right.
but anyway, but so later life, and I like to talk about how later life presents us with a number of what I call narrative tasks, which and I'm going to confess here that sometimes I fear that in our society we view aging in a negative way overall. And even my own beloved discipline of gerontology does tend to focus a lot on the biomedical aspects of the aging process, which are real and important and are not to be sneezed at. You know, the aching joints and the failing memory and the eyesight that doesn't, you know, in the hearing that doesn't work as well as it used to. All those things are real, but there are what I call I think of those as the kind of the outer aspects of the aging process. There's a whole world of what you could call the inner or inside aspects of aging that are harder to measure and subtler, and they go beneath the radar in many cases. But among the narrative tasks, I call them, that I think await us as we move into our 50s and 60s is what the well-known psychologist Erik Erikson calls life review.
Right.
There is a kind of a instinctive, automatic tendency, not necessarily universally experienced, but a tendency to start looking back over the past more than looking ahead into the future. I mean, you're still looking ahead in the future because we're kind of all wired that way. But, you know, you turn 50, 60, 70, I just turned 70, there is a kind of a curiosity about the past and a desire to make sense of the past, to lay the past all out and have I have a desire to rent a room on campus and clear out all the books, all the tables and chairs, and spread out all the cards and letters, as Dean Martin would say, that people have sent me, and pictures that I've retained of various parts of my past. Lay it all out there and say, whew, these are all kind of representatives or symbols, reminders of the complexity of my life. And I want to do some gentle evaluation, hopefully coming to the conclusion, you know what, all things considered, I've had a good life so far. I feel good about it. And I mean, I could have done things differently, whatever, but I did the best I could with the abilities that I had and the circumstances I faced, blah, blah, blah. So
But that is the exploration of the narrative, right? I mean, that's what.
yeah, because we can't, I don't think we can think of our lives apart from in narrative terms. Like it's the same sort of way when you ask me, who are you? Tell me about yourself. I'm not going to rattle off to you a bunch of statistics about my shoe size, my
Yes.
weight, and whatever. I'm going to say, well, I was born at a very young age, and I grew up in Harvey Station, and blah blah blah. I'm going to give you some kind of a little narrative because that's the way I understand who I am, what my identity is. So I think later life, Bill, because there is this sort of narrative of decline that kind of hangs in the air and shapes what we think aging is. So we tend to see it as a downer, as not having a lot of sort of redeeming dimensions to it. I think there's so much exciting stuff that happens and can happen on that inner narrative level as we get older.
There's a quote. I want to read a quote. I'm going to interrupt you because I want to read a quote because I think it's going right into that comment. And this happened to me a lot when I was reading your book. I would be reading along, and as you read a book, blah, 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 and then all of a sudden I would stop. Like a sentence would literally drop me in my tracks, and I had to deconstruct my understanding of myself, deconstruct my understanding of my perception of narrative, deconstruct my understanding of relationship. I mean, that starts to happen a lot. And this one at my age, really kind of had an impact. Okay, so I'm going to just read it. This is, and true, their hearts can be filled with a sense of the tasks of the slow questions that aging is nudging them to address, well below the realm of words. And I just went, aging is nudging them to address slow questions, well below the realm of words. Can you discuss that a little bit? Because I think that's, as I get older, and as we get older, and I mean that can be from 20 to 30 or from 50 to 70, that we awaken to questions we didn't have before. And at 60 or older, the questions have a newness, a freshness to them.
Yes,
is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, there's a phrase that I picked up from a wonderful book called "From Aging to Saging" by Rabbi Shachter Shalomi, and he talks about the philosophic homework of later life, and wow. And I think that's just a wonderful phrase. It could sound kind of off-putting because homework sounds like a negative thing. I got to bring out my books and papers and pencils and go to school. He doesn't mean that. He means the sort of thing you just kind of alluded to in reading that quotation. Yeah. Slow questions that the recurring themes in our relationships, in our involvements in life, our activities and so forth, that we potentially become more aware of and more curious about as we get older. I think we have the opportunity to know ourselves at a deeper level than we had time for, or perhaps inclination for earlier on. And maybe that's one of the goals of the aging process, is to help us, as one writer says, to possess all that we have been and done, which may take some time, that writer says, in her 80s. But when we do that, she said, we become fierce with reality. I once said to my mother, who's 90,
fierce with reality. Did you say fierce with reality?
Fierce with reality.
That's a great phrase.
Yeah. And maybe I think of that increasingly as maybe one of the goals of the aging process, is by one means or another. And that leaves dementia as a topic to be discussed if we want to get into that. But I mean, that's, I think, one of the goals is to do that pull yourself together. You've heard people say that to other people, maybe to yourself, pull yourself together, But I think that's part of what aging invites us or nudges us to do, which is to kind of pull all the parts together as much as we can. And that's a work of reflection and memory and maybe writing and so forth, or conversing with other people who have been part of our lives. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
It's okay. No, but I just, in terms of that train of thought, the other thing that I'm thinking is that during this pandemic, it's almost like we've been forced to isolate, to spend more time with us, with ourselves, with each other, with our families, and it's caused a shift in dialogue. It's caused a shift in how we communicate with each other, but also how we think. And in terms of aging, as the ears start to go and as the eyes start to go, and as the body slows down, there is kind of a congestion of a coming together into the self, and of a self-reflection that's forced on us by circumstance, right?
Exactly. I mean, I don't know, what your thoughts are on psychologists such as Carl Jung, but Carl Jung has written a wonderful little essay on the stages of life,
Yes.
In which he talks about the morning of life and the afternoon of life. And he says the afternoon of life is something that we live by a different kind of ethos, or are invited to live by a different ethos than the morning of life. And he says it is the duty of us as we age to turn inward. Now that sounds kind of narcissistic, you might think, but I don't think he meant it in that way at all. He was all about, in his book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which was his kind of autobiography. He was all about, doing that, pulling together an assembling of yourself in preparation for what the next phase might be, which is another whole question.
Yeah. And he actually near the end of his life said, I don't know. He was quite shocked at all he'd learned and still all he didn't know. And there's a wonderful quote, I wish I had it, but he talks about that exact feeling of getting older in life, then looking back and suddenly saying, there was so much else I could have learned,
Well, that's to me, when I read that passage, and I know the one you're referring to, it's the very end of his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections.
That's right.
Maybe you can find it there. I think it's on one of the last pages of that In Our Stories Lies Our Strength. It's powerful. But to me, I've taken that as a statement of wonder on the part of Mr. Jung. That when he stepped back from the life, the 80 years that he lived, all that he'd done and seen and witnessed and heard, he realized that, I don't know an awful lot. It's also reminiscent of that wonderful comment that Isaac Newton apparently, made. He says, I feel sometimes like, Isaac Newton, all of the theories and so forth that he developed that has set science, on its path in a big way. He made a comment. He said, I feel sometimes like I'm a small child on the seashore, every now and again picking up a pebble and marveling at, how unique it is, while the whole ocean of truth lays out undiscovered before me.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And I think that to me, that wonder is a potential. I mean, Erickson talks about wisdom as the potential to be gained in the later stages of development. I think beyond wisdom is wonder, or wisdom bound up with wonder, and that becoming like a little child again. To me, that's part of the adventure of aging that I'm more increasingly fascinated with.
Yeah, it was fun. Einstein was asked about something, and he said that I'm a slow thinker, and so in my later years I'm actually asking the same questions that a child would ask. Yes. Which I thought was a nice reflection. But you have another quote, by the way, at the end of your book. When I got to the end of the book and there were all these quotes, I'm like, the man is, we're too simpatico. I love quotes because of the explosion of thought that come out of them often, right? And the how provoking they can be. And this one I loved. This is from Jerome Bruner, who's as you know, and he said, a life is not how it was, but how it is interpreted and reinterpreted, told and retold. A life as lived is inseparable from a life as told. In the end, we become the autobiographical narratives of which we tell about our lives. And I thought that's very much a summation of what we're discussing here, is that as we get older, those narratives, like you mentioned in one of the stories that you tell, and I wonder if you'd relate it, the iron lung story. I call it the iron lung story.
Yeah, I could tell that. But thanks for bringing in Bruner, because he lived to be 100 plus, I think, and he was still going strong. And he had converted sort of as from being a cognitive scientist to being a narrative psychologist. And his latter 30 years, he was devoting his writing time to books and articles on the narrative dimension of life. And that quote you just read is vintage Bruner.
Yeah.
And it's vintage Bruner in part because it captures the idea that started me off on this whole rabbit chase back when I went back to school and did my doctorate. My dissertation, which became a book, was called The Stories We Are, an essay on self-creation. And I still believe that we are in many ways our stories. However, that said, our stories are continually changing and thickening and richening and can be interpreted from multiple angles. So it's not like we're stuck with one story and that's it, too bad. So the iron lung stories, yeah, okay, I can share that with you. So
No, but it's just because it's an illustration of how our personal narrative, we hold it, and then somebody comes along and goes, just a second, so.
yeah. Okay, so when I was 2 years of age, Bill, along with my two older sisters, contracted polio. Polio was the COVID of the 50s, okay?
Mhm.
And everybody was, they didn't really were wearing masks, but they were very conscious, certainly here in the Maritimes, of getting exposed to the virus or bacteria or whatever was at the root of polio. So all three of us Randall kids caught it. My sister Carol was, significantly disabled and has been physically disabled, not in any other way, for all of her life. She's now 77. My sister Donna had polio of the trachea and just about died as a 6-year-old kid because she couldn't breathe. And I had polio of the diaphragm, which is that muscle structure that helps our lungs to breathe and so forth.
Yes.
And so for 2 weeks, I was put in an iron lung in St. John General Hospital, the one that's now been torn down and replaced by a fancy schmancy new hospital. So for years, I had this image of myself being in an iron lung in a kind of a sparse hospital room in a fog enshrouded city, all there by myself. It's not much of a story. It's more like just an image around which a kind of a story could be constructed. But over the years, I have heard myself trot out this, what I call signature story, to umpteen people at parties, social occasions, when sometimes the conversation turns to diseases that we've suffered and survived. And I said, I was in an iron lung for 2 weeks as a 2-year-old. I inevitably would get a lot of sympathy, and some attention that, I could use.
That's part of the story right there.
Exactly. So for years, I was the kid from the iron lung. But in my mid 40s, I was living in Toronto at the time, and I came to New Brunswick to spend a few weeks with my parents. We were sitting at the lake, Harvey Lake, beautiful afternoon. We had a beverage or two. And I was in a mood of sort of, sharing with my parents how grateful I was to them for all of the kindness that they'd shown us, all the sacrifices that they'd made to bring us kids up, particularly 3 kids suffering from polio. And oh yes, those were some pretty tough times. We didn't know. Hard to pay the bills. It was kind of before Medicare was of the nature we know it now.
Right.
And then I said, and when I was in the iron lung for 2 weeks, that must have been tough for you. My mother goes, huh? What are you talking about? Well, I was in an iron lung for 2 weeks. I had polio of the diaphragm. Yes, you had polio of the diaphragm. We were concerned about you, but we put you in an oxygen tent. The doctor put you in an oxygen tent, and we rubbed your chest with maybe the 50s equivalent of Vapo Rub or whatever, make you feel and breathe a bit better. But you're never in an iron lung. Where'd you get that idea? So I thought, whoa. And I was annoyed because I felt that they were suffering from fake news. Yeah, I felt that they were suffering from fake news or whatever, that they couldn't handle the truth, because but anyway, I ultimately had to concede that they were right and I was wrong, that there was no iron lung. I almost felt like I should go back to all those people at all those parties and apologize for having lied through my teeth, but I didn't know I was lying at the time. So there's the story of Billy in an iron lung, which I realized as I have thought about it, and this is what I encourage people to do, is to think about, to step back from, to read and reread and play with these stories that you thought were just so, and not to knock the legs out from under your sense of identity, but to enable you to sort of appreciate the multiple layers of meaning that our stories can have for us.
And
So
it's humbling, right? I mean, that's that exploration that you're discussing is. I mean, one of my sisters, suddenly decided that my namesake was from Prince Edward Island was an opium addict,
okay.
and she started telling the story, and I was like, no, no, he had problems, but I couldn't picture opium on PEI, and that much at that time. And so I called my other sister, of course, and I said, excuse me, but like, did you know that Willie, they call him Willie, did you know that Willie was an opium addict? She went, oh, he wasn't. And I said, well, Joan's convinced it, right? And so we had this discussion, and I was right in the middle of one of your books at this point. And I thought, isn't that interesting, because with checking the narrative, this is what I'm getting to. The point of this is checking the narrative is a fascinating thing to do when you've got people that were there or were around, or and just sort of running it, and it does create a humility. Like we just lived through, as I say, 4 bad years. I'll just call them 4 years of really tough conflict of narrative. And it looks like it's a real time for us to not just in the United States, but here in Canada too, to sit down and say, where have the narratives that have been ruling our lives brought us as a people, and to humbly ask that and then explore that. That seems to be where your books are pushing me to.
Yeah, we live within these larger stories that are unfolding around us. We're not immune to them. We're shaped by them on some profound level. And we've just had, as you suggest, 4 years of head scratching in terms of, well, what is truth? Remember that old Johnny Cash song, and the lonely voice of youth cries, what is truth? There's, truth is a complex and tortured concept in and of itself. And the whole concept of narrative and truth has a whole body of books and literature on it as well, be sure. Because, there's a truth for me, or has been a truth for me in my arm and lung story. And when I've reflected in recent months and years on what was in that, what's been in that story for me, why did I hold on to it? Why did it stick in my imagination, wrong though the facts of it were? Because it provided me with a kind of an image of myself as a hero on some level, not a hero in a braggartly kind of way, but I survived 2 weeks in the iron lung. I beat the iron lung, so I can do anything.
That's right.
So there's a narrative truth that that's in those stories often that isn't always sort of supported by the historical truth dimension.
Well, yeah, the line that I love to use is don't let the history stand in the way of a good story, right?
Well, there's one psychoanalyst named Donald Spence wrote a book with that as the concept, or that as the title, Narrative Truth and Historical Truth. And he talks about how in the psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic process, you could argue that what the analyst or therapist is helping the client to do is to craft a story that enables them to move on, to live into their own uniqueness and specialness in a forward kind of way, to have narrative openness, as I would call it, as opposed to narrative foreclosure.
Narrative openness was a good one, and we've got to end this wonderful conversation. I don't want this conversation to end, but we're going to have to, because we've got to have some kind of closure. Yeah. But you mentioned the narrative, spiritual narrative. You mentioned you wanted to get to that at some point. Yeah. I wouldn't mind rounding it out with that, because it seems to be a rather beautiful and profound place to stop.
Yeah, I mean the motivation for that book in Our Stories Lies Our Strength was for me to try to weave together as best I could the 3 big strands of thought and experience and curiosity that have motivated me for the last 40 years. Aging, I study it, I teach it, I'm living it. Spirituality, I was a minister of religion. Of course, religion and spirituality have a kind of a, not an always automatic kind of connection. And I've continued, I feel, to be a very spiritually oriented kind of guy. And narrative, which has totally blown me out of the water in terms of curiosity, and just been a lifetime of exciting ideas to explore and write about. What I'm writing about now, and if I could just say a little bit, because I think it really does point to what I think of as the implicit spiritual, broadly defined dimension of the aging process. And I mean, I've got lots of books that talk about aging and spirituality, broadly defined, which could be viewed as the innate human need to make meaning of ourselves and of the bigger picture. Okay,
Yeah.
that is a fundamental and elemental dimension of the aging process, and that it's no surprise that when you look at mainstream churches nowadays, when people can sit in the pews in their church or their synagogue or temple or whatever, or their mosque, it's might be older people, unless it's these big new shiny churches where you've got more young people. But I remember visiting this elderly chap in my congregation years ago, and he was retired, kind of a sarcastic guy, good sense of humor. But I noticed when I went to lunch with him and his wife one day that he had the Bible earmarked and sitting on his his little reading table, and I didn't really peg him as a Bible kind of guy. So I said, "Hey, Jim, what's going on with this Bible there?" And he says, "Well, Bill," he says, "I'm cramming for my finals." I'm cramming for my final, which was a humorous way of capturing that. So as we get older, we start to think about the bigger story in earnest. We realize that our life is relatively short. We hope we've made a pretty good job of it while we were here, but we're increasingly, curious and wondering, and maybe even open to what might be next, the bigger picture, and so forth. So my present project, which I hope will come to fruition at some point, is thinking about aging not as tragedy, but as adventure. An adventure outward, an adventure inward, an adventure backward, an adventure forward. And I could talk about that, but this idea of the aging process as implicitly spiritual and as pulling us, inviting us, nudging us to what one writer calls the big adventure.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think
yeah,
there's so much emphasis on aging as kind of a tragic sort of process. If we can avoid it or postpone it or repair body parts to indefinitely delay it, then that would be great. But I think aging is ultimately something to be embraced. It's part of the journey of life, and there are so many wonderful things to be learned and discovered, like we do when we go on adventures.
Yeah.
The adventure of life and the adventure of aging, to me, this is what I want to spend a lot of time reflecting on and maybe writing about going forward.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Randall, thank you. This has been a podcast. This is my bringing Shift for Brains into a new era, and I can't think of a better way to start, because it's going to change my story, and hopefully it'll change the story of those people that are listening. That it'll shift their brains so that they'll see aging, but they'll also see their story differently, their narrative and the arc of that narrative, and the relational nature of that narrative. Is there anything you want to end with, sir?
Huge thank you for this opportunity. I love our conversations, Bill. And I think that for me, conversations like this are part of what I call the adventure outward and inward, because new ideas come up, new connections get made in your brain and my brain, and these conversations change us. They're also, I think, examples of what my colleague Gary Kenyon and I refer to as wisdom environments, where we have nice sharing and telling from each other's respective lives and stories, and the result is a pulling out from each other that wisdom that's there, just below the surface. Those slow questions.
And been earned.
Pardon me?
And been earned.
And been earned, yes,
Yeah.
often in hard ways. We could go on with so many other topics that we've just touched on, but thank you.
I don't think this will be our last podcast together.
Hope so.
Mr. Brandon, thank you so much.
Okay.
Blessings on you, man.